All right, well, let's go ahead and get going. Looks like it's after. So I'm Dr. Ryan Jackwood. I'm the science director of the Harpeth Conservancy, and I'm going to talk a couple minutes about kind of what our organization does in throughout the state of Tennessee, just to kind of give you guys a rough overview. But then I'm going to try to kick it over pretty fast to our speakers, so we can give them a bunch of time to kind of talk about what their specialties are and their interests are. And I'm sure you all looked at the title of this conservation conversation, but we're mainly going to be talking about algae, the toxins they produce, and kind of how we can protect our pets and what kind of information we would want to know about kind of pet health. And so I'll go ahead and get going here. So our vision at the Harpeth Conservancy is clean water and healthy ecosystems for rivers championed by the people who live here. And so we really try to kind of educate people in the area and really get people passionate and, you know, become advocates for a lot of our causes. So we work in kind of four main spaces, I guess, or specialties. We have our clean water protection program, which is a lot of our policy work, and our COO, Jim Redwine, kind of does a lot of that work and looks at kind of the legalese and permits and whether, you know, basically kind of being a watchdog for a lot of the environmental actions in the area. We have a river science program, which is kind of what my world is, and we do water quality monitoring. We do some other science studies. We communicate with TDEC and kind of are kind of an expert in the area of watershed monitoring and restoration. Our third area is rural protection and land use, and that's kind of basically helping to keep the development of the area and in check, since we're such a fast-growing region that it's, you know, we don't want to grow in ways that aren't smart for the environment, basically. And then finally, community engagement and leadership building, and that's a lot of kind of our, you know, this conservation conversation would fall within that. And it's a lot of our kind of education and outreach that we do in the region. And so some of that is in person, some of that is online. We've had to, you know, obviously adjust with COVID, but we want to keep kind of trying to spread the word and keep trying to educate people and putting on cool events that you guys are interested in. I'll toss this over to our development director, Haley Hall, to kind of talk about some of our upcoming events.
Thanks, Ryan. So we have two different programs. What you've tuned in tonight is our conservation conversations, and those are held on the fourth Wednesday of every month. We also have a complementary program with that, our Lessons on the River. And the Lessons on the River are an in-person, hands-on activity, and we are being very COVID responsible, physically distanced, safe during these times. And so if you want to do any of those in-person things, you can see we have one this Saturday. That'll be at Edwin Warner Park. It's very cool. We did one last month. You actually can get in the river. We've got nets and turning over rocks and showing folks what are in the river, as well as a scavenger hunt / bingo. And also Ryan doing a little bit more about what's in your water where you can actually see in person. So then we have August 8th is a family fun day. And all these are free, thanks to our sponsors, you can see along the bottom. Our family fun day will have fly fishing, demonstration and lessons, water safety, kids kayaking, scavenger hunt, free snow cones. So it'll be a lot of fun. Great way to get in the river and stay cool. And then we switched a little more during the summer. We have family friendly, and then we switch to a little more adult oriented content. Craft beer, talking about why local rivers and clean water matters. Then photographing on the river with some local specialists who do really great river and outdoor photography. And then you can read on, we'll do November, actually seeing your drinking water plant. Then giving December off. In January, we'll expand on part of the conversation today, going further into a lot of people get new pets over the holidays. And so in general, how water matters, not just with regards to algae blooms. And then doing as we go into the legislative session, how to make your voice heard to make a difference, where you can help us keep clean water. So as Ryan said, we're championed by the people who live here. So what tonight is a conservation conversation. As I mentioned, those are the fourth Wednesday of every month. They're free. You guys clearly registered. We love your feedback. You'll get a survey after this one. We'd love for you to help share the word. The August one will be primarily focused on getting your lawns ready, as most people do in the fall for the coming year, and preparations on that. One of the things that Ryan will talk about today a little bit is things that cause the algae blooms, and some of that is nitrogen and phosphorus, and that is depending on how you fertilize your lawn. So listen a little bit today and then learn how to be a part of the solution in August and make a difference. And then we're still working, those we're programming about every quarter. So look forward to more content on that as we go. And then as far as fundraising events and those kind of events really concentrate on education and knowledge about the river. These are just a little more fun. So on Friday, July 31st, we will do a actual float down the river. So that'll be limited to 30 people, again, physically distanced. Portion of the proceeds come to us. So if you're interested in that, email us or contact us, or go to our website and you can register on there. Our Wild and Scenic Film Festival, COVID is affecting us a little bit, so we're still figuring out exactly the date and the content for that, but it's got a lot of shorts about current issues and things related to our work and how to get involved. And this year, a lot of it will focus on environmental equity, so it should be great content. Once we have more details, that'll probably be October, November. And then we are proceeding with our River Swing. This will be our 17th annual. Smaller groups, limited to 250. It's our largest fundraiser. We can always use fundraising support to keep great programs like this going. And then we do our year-end fundraising in December. So all you guys will probably get a mailing about that. Support us if you can. And thanks for joining us tonight. So back to our smart team to help us learn more while we actually really tuned in.
Thanks, Haley. Here's just a couple other kind of initiatives that we have going. You can kind of get on our website and read a lot about this, but if you're interested in volunteering, if you want to plan your own cleanup and need kind of some of our help to do that, we've got a water reporter app that allows you to kind of help monitor the river for us, and then some of kind of the fundraising aspects. If you sign up for our Amazon Smile, our Kroger rewards, and then get our license plate.
Especially right now while we're doing COVID. If you're using Amazon Smile, pick us as your charity.
So on to our experts today. We've got Ken Gibbons, who's holds a master's degree from the University of Toledo. That's where we actually met, and he specializes in harmful algal blooms in the Great Lakes. And then we have Dr. Judy Jackwood, who's actually my mom. So I've known her for quite a while, and she's a veterinarian at the Orrville Veterinary Clinic in Worcester, Ohio. And then I'll kind of cap off the presentation today with just kind of some of the local things that we're doing here, kind of in the Nashville and Tennessee area to combat harmful algal blooms. So with that, I am going to put up Ken's PowerPoint and get him going. So Ken, whenever you're ready, you can kind of introduce yourself if I've missed something, and then take it away.
Oh, well, great. And thank you for having me. So today I'm going to give just a brief introduction to harmful algal blooms. As Ryan mentioned, I got my master's in biology from the University of Toledo, and I primarily focused on harmful algal blooms and nutrient cycling in Lake Erie. And so a lot of the examples I'll use today are from the Great Lakes region, but these are applicable kind of across the US and freshwater. So as you can see, my background of this photo is the western half of Lake Erie, and you can see kind of the green blob of this huge algal bloom forming. So you go to the next slide. So an overview of what I'm going to talk about today is I'll cover what are HABs, what causes HABs, what do HABs affect, kind of like your ecosystem services, and what can be done to kind of mitigate or prevent HABs. So, and what are HABs is kind of a two-part definition. So first, you kind of have to have harmful algae, which would just be any sort of algae that's producing toxins harmful to people. And then blooms, you need an excessive quantity of algae, kind of like if you remember my introductory slide of, where the water's dark green. And so that's what kind of defines a harmful algal bloom. So I want to point out too that not all algae are bad. So in Lake Erie, there's kind of three main algal groups throughout the year. There's diatoms and greens, which those support kind of the base of the food web. And without those, we wouldn't have as great of a fishery in Lake Erie as we do. And kind of the issue or nuisance algae is the blue-greens or cyanobacteria. You want to go to the next slide? And so these are kind of the common types of harmful algal blooms. And you'll see I have algae in quotes because technically they're not algae, but they're cyanobacteria. Some common ones are Anabina, Aphanizomenon, Microcystis, Planktothrix, and Lingdia. For Lake Erie, you hear a lot about Microcystis. So again, to be a harmful algal bloom, they have to produce toxins or be harmful. So here's kind of a list of the different types of algae and what toxins they produce. So for example, Microcystis produces microcystin as the toxin. Anabina, another common cyanobacteria, produces cylindospermopsin, anatoxin, and saxitoxin. These are kind of the categories of toxins. You may see in articles they'll reference like microcystin LR. That's a different congener or specific shape of the toxin. And I think, and Ryan can correct me if I'm wrong, but I think there's around 180 congeners just for microcystin. So there's a huge variety of toxins under each one of these categories.
I think it goes up every year. I think they keep discovering more.
Yeah, so it's hard. It's hard to keep up with. It's a whole body of research there. You want to go to the next slide? And so then, going back to the blooms, these thick, dense scums, and these are occurring, not just in the Great Lakes or in the U.S., but worldwide. So the top picture here is Lake Taihu in China. You can see the water's almost like paint. It's so thick with algae. The bottom left is Lake Winnipeg, and then the Baltic Sea. And in addition, you may see articles on the Ohio River recently had a harmful algal bloom that spanned a significant portion of at least Ohio's coast. So what causes harmful algal blooms? Well, they respond to light, warm temperatures, and excessive nutrients. I have excessive nutrients highlighted in yellow because that's really, when you think from a management perspective, the part that you can adjust or reduce. Light, coming from the sun, there's some techniques to shade the water. You may see at a golf course or something where the water's super blue to try and prevent harmful algal blooms. And the water temperature is really not something you can easily adjust. So when managing HABs, you think of the nutrient loading. So the nutrients are coming from the watershed. So on the left top here, I have the skyline of the city of Toledo, and below that, the kind of agricultural lands that surround it. So during a rainstorm, water can run off from those areas, and with it carries sediment and nutrients into the river and eventually to your lake or stream or water body. On the right, you can kind of see the top right, a huge sediment plume. The sediments also carrying substantial amount of nutrients. And then the bottom right is a harmful algal bloom in Lake Erie. So you can see it's really thick and potentially toxic. And so when we're talking about nutrients, we're really focused on nitrogen and phosphorus. for a long time, phosphorus was the primary focus for freshwater harmful algal blooms, but kind of emerging research is also looking at nitrogen for toxicity as well as the size of the bloom. The next slide. So looking at the effects of HABs, you can kind of see them periodically throughout the news. So, first title I have is Toxins Overwhelm Carroll Township Water Plant. Also, I think that made national headlines was the city of Toledo had a 2 to 3 day do not drink advisory when toxin levels were so high in their source water that they couldn't filter it out. So people, around 500,000 people couldn't drink the water for a few days. When toxins aren't shutting down the drinking water plants, they still cost a lot more to filter the water. So you can see the next headline, toxin to cost Toledo another $1 million in treatment cost, because they have to put more treatment in to reduce the toxin levels to a safe level. And also, algal blooms deter recreation. It's not safe to swim in these bloom conditions, so you'll have beach closures, or the charter fishing industry will have to kind of avoid the algal blooms. And so more recently, just earlier this month, you see that algal bloom found along the Maumee River in downtown Toledo. So in some river environments where the water really slows to where it's almost like a lake or a pool in the river, harmful algal blooms can be found there. And in addition to being toxic to people, it's also harmful to your pets. So earlier this month, there was a report that a harmful algal bloom killed a dog at Zion National Park. So what can be done? Well, this is kind of speaking in general terms, but it's really specific to your watershed. But best manage, the overall goal is to reduce the loss of sediment and nutrients from the land. So best management practices on agricultural lands. The photo on the bottom left is a filter strip along 2 farm fields, and that slows the water and removes sediment before it reaches the ditch. In community settings, the addition of green infrastructure can decrease the amount of water going into stormwater drains, as well as it can pull out sediments and nutrients from that. And finally, although permitted, sometimes reductions in point sources are needed to reach goals. And point sources can be thought of as wastewater treatment plants or factories, any sort of source of nutrients that's coming directly from a pipe.
Any last thoughts, Ken? I think your last slide was just a question slide, but I
Yeah,
want to hold questions till the end.
Yeah, no. I'll be happy to answer questions at the end.
Thanks. That was really informative, and I like your I like kind of the perspective from Lake Erie, and kind of like how you made it broad, and you're totally right. We actually are we have kind of the river down here. So a bunch of the rivers down here, when we get drought conditions, they get really slow, and we see blooms on them too.
Yeah, those are almost kind of like lakes at that point.
Yeah, they just kind of sit there. Okay, next up we have Dr. Judy Jackwood. She's, like I mentioned, a veterinarian from the Orrville Veterinary Clinic, and she's going to be talking about kind of algal blooms and how they would potentially impact pet and animal health. So, Mom, I'll let you take it away.
Thank you. Thank you, and it's nice to be here. So I am going to talk about algal blooms and how they relate to illness in animals. This is a concern to me not only as a vet, but especially as a dog owner. I do a lot of hiking with my dog, especially in areas with streams and lakes. She loves to swim, play in the water. So right now is a time I'm especially careful kind of where we go and what we do. And so next slide. So Ken mentioned this kind of headlines about a dog that died from an algal bloom at Zion National Park in Utah. In this case, and this was about a week ago, the dog couldn't walk, it was painful, and it had seizures. And it died about an hour after swimming in the park. It was consistent with exposure to one of the algal blooms toxins called an anatoxin A. And this is a nervous system toxin produced by the Cyanobacteria. And it was later documented to be in the water in more than 55 micrograms per liter in a sample taken of the water. And human health recommends less than 15 micrograms per liter. So the dog definitely had a big exposure. Public health warnings went up and signs not to get into the water. And I think they had used that for drinking, which obviously they quit using. So these toxic algal blooms, like Ken said, are also considered, we kind of use as cyanobacteria in these blooms kind of interchangeably. And there are about 2,000 species, and about 40 of them produce the toxins. So it's the toxins that cause the disease and death in both animals and people. Mostly, probably from the animal point of view, the most common sources are kind of the standing water, lakes and ponds. And then the concentration of these blooms obviously are different during different times of the year. And it's kind of these big growth spurts or blooms that are in the hot weather that seem to be kind of the biggest problem and the producer of the toxins. And again, it's in the nutrient-rich water, fertilizer runoff, sewage runoff. And by looking, you can't distinguish which blooms are going to be toxic and which aren't. And the toxins aren't spread out in the water evenly. They seem to develop little pockets. And wind can push the blooms plus the toxins like to sides of a pond. And one area of the pond can have water that's safe to drink, and another area can have water that has the toxins in it. So the Cyanobacteria toxicosis is an acute and often a fatal condition caused by these toxins that are generated by the cyanobacteria. Illness has been documented in livestock, wildlife, birds, dogs, and other aquatic animals. And dogs are actually more at risk than most other animals because they like to play in the water. They fetch balls and sticks, have their mouth open, and they end up drinking a lot of the water. Then they get out and lick their fur, and some of the fur can have the toxins on it also. So the main areas where we see problems are on the skin and with the liver and the nervous system. So the hepatotoxins, or the nervous system toxin, the microcystin and the nodularin, the toxin gets ingested, it's absorbed into the small intestine, then it enters the portal vein, and a bile acid transporter actually just takes it directly into the liver cells. The liver cells are killed pretty quickly, and then you just get bleeding, massive bleeding into the liver, and causes death. If some of the toxins enters the kidneys, then you can get renal failure also. The neurotoxins, the toxin, the anatoxin A, can bind to some of the receptors of the nervous system on muscles, and it binds irreversibly. So you just get kind of tetany, the continuous contraction of the muscles. Eventually the muscle gets fatigued. Eventually it gets paralyzed, And then because you have paralysis of the respiratory muscles, then brain doesn't get oxygen. So that causes death. That toxin is really potent, and it doesn't take very much to cause death. The antitoxin AS is another neurotoxin, and it kind of works in a different part of the nervous system, but it produces a lot of salivation, a lot of respiratory secretions, slows the heart rate down, and it can also cause some diarrhea and vomiting. So death from that one occurs from heart and respiratory failure. And then the contact dermatitis, we're not sure exactly what causes some of that, but it can cause some severe allergic reactions. And one of the bacterial pigments was identified as one cause for this reaction. So you get hives, you can get blisters and rash on skin, and that can be people or pets. So the symptoms and the diagnosis and the treatment, especially in dogs, the symptoms of diarrhea, the vomiting, drooling, weakness, collapse, seizures, rashes. To diagnose it, most commonly we diagnose it by the history of exposure to water that may contain these algal blooms, and then also by the symptoms that we just went over. Rarely do we get to use identification of the toxins, but if you can get water samples or samples of the stomach contents or even fur samples, there are some veterinary labs that you can get those analyzed and find out what it is. But unfortunately, most of the time it's post-mortem. So the treatment, first you have to kind of think about the fact that this can cause a contact dermatitis, and so all the people working on the dog usually have to be concerned about them getting rashes on their arms and body. So kind of be cautious. If you can wash the dog, that's the best. There's no antidote to these toxins, so we have to manage kind of the life-threatening symptoms, treat for shock. We can put them on ventilators, use oxygen, IV fluids, blood work to try to figure out what's wrong, to see what we can correct. Dogs poisoned by the neurotoxins usually have signs 5 to 20 minutes after they're exposed, and death occurs pretty quickly. Usually they don't make it to the vet. And obviously the liver hepatotoxins aren't a whole lot better either. Prognosis is poor, but it does depend on how much exposure the animal got. If they just got it on their skin or just ingested a little bit, at least you have a chance. So kind of clean off the dog, get them to your vet. And as a veterinarian, I have a responsibility to report any suspected cases to the public health department because of the possibility of this toxin getting into people, getting to people or people ingesting it. So how do you keep your dog safe? Don't let your dog drink from the ponds, lakes, kind of especially standing water. Those harmful algal blooms, especially those pictures that we saw, they can be blue or bright green or brown or red. Sometimes the water looks like paint floating on top of it, but you can't tell by looking if there are any toxins in the water. So better to be safe than sorry. And the toxins aren't visible, so you just don't exactly know. Toxins also can have a bad odor, but the dog actually usually likes that odor. So, yeah, especially with your dogs, if you think they've been exposed, clean them off and contact your vet. There were some, next slide, some cases reported in the Veterinary Information Network 2 years ago about a herd of cattle. There were 45 head of cattle that they had suspected cyanobacteria toxin ingested. 5 of the cattle died. 10 recovered once they removed them from the pond that was in the pasture. The symptoms that the cattle had were kind of the neurologic signs, some seizures, disorientation. They had some jaundice, which would be kind of liver damage, and blistering kind of on the teat and udder and in their nasal passages. So fortunately, I have never seen a case of this toxicosis. And I did talk to the the large animal veterinarians in our practice. I work at a mixed animal practice. There's a lot of farmland in our area and a lot of dairies, and nobody that I talked to had any cases of this either. But I also just got a report from the Ohio Department of Health they're right now sending out information to pet owners, animal owners, and to the veterinarians, kind of reminding us of this possibility, so we keep our eyes open. So that's all I got. Thank you.
Thanks, Mom. That was really great, and I learned a lot when I was kind of helping put this together with you. But that was really cool. Okay, so now
I do have a couple questions.
Oh, sure. Yeah, we can address some of those.
Do you want me to wait till the very end, or?
No, I mean, if they're veterinary related, go ahead and ask them. We can
go. So, 2 questions I think that probably could be a 1 and 2 part is, A, does it matter the size of the body? Somebody was asking if is it possible in small ponds? So I guess size of the pond and running versus standing. And then the second part is the water's clear, but then there's algae on the rocks. Is it just like the paint and the green? If the water looks clear, can they still be in there? So those are the 2 questions.
And I'm probably going to send those questions to the water people.
Okay.
The thing that probably matters in the animal end of it is kind of the size of the animal, the amount of water they ingest, and or the contact they've had. But I have those questions too, because the streams that we kind of walk around have like a little bit of algae on the rocks, but the water's clear. I'm hoping they're going to say if it's flowing water and it's fairly clear, that's a little bit safer. So I'll turn it over to them.
Okay, yeah, perfect, thanks. And then Ryan, I'll let you go on with yours, and you can answer those at the beginning or the end, however you want.
Actually, yeah, I kind of addressed that a little bit in mine, and then we can circle back, and I'll get Ken's thoughts on that too.
Perfect.
Okay, so I'm just going to talk briefly about kind of some of the stuff that we at the Harpeth Conservancy are doing kind of to address or at least monitor algae in our area. And so basically last fall, since kind of ultimately there's not a whole lot of algae toxin sampling going on in the state of Tennessee as a whole. And so I couldn't find kind of any data whether or not we had algal toxins in the Harpeth or the Cumberland, or at least anything that was kind of publicly available. And so we decided to perform a toxin survey, and just kind of as a preliminary, like, hey, is it here or is it not? Because, and something Ken will tell you too, that algae can be in the water, but if it doesn't have the toxin producing genetics, then it can't produce toxin at all. So if there's no toxin anywhere, then it's probably likely that we don't have any of those algae that can actually produce the toxin. So we kind of wanted to distinguish that, whether or not we were actually seeing toxin kind of in our backyards or not. So between September 14th and October 2nd last year, we collected almost 20 water samples and basically analyzed them for one type of microcystin toxin. And so as you've kind of seen in our previous 2 presenters, they've highlighted, a whole bunch of different toxins. Well, you got to balance your cost, and microcystin is kind of regarded as the most common. So if you're going to go for just trying to, like, say presence absence, whether it's in the water, microcystin is kind of the go-to. But that doesn't mean that, other toxin weren't there and microcystin wasn't. So So that's kind of the disclaimer I'll put on this, is that, we didn't test for every toxin that we talked about, but we did do one of the more common ones. And so here, basically all of the different locations and dates that we collected samples, and by and large, we didn't detect microcystin in those areas. We tried to kind of target, seemed like that there was algae, that we kind of noticed it was particularly green in the September to October area or period, when it's, when it's hot, or kind of the water is the most warm because it's been hot throughout the summer. That's usually when we see kind of the low flow, high nutrients, warm conditions that might produce, that might give algal blooms and then produce these toxins. But we did find two locations that were actually producing the toxin. And that was kind of ended up becoming a concern to us, because then that meant that the correct type of algae with the correct type of genetics could actually produce microcystin. And it was in enough concentration that it was detectable. It wasn't in enough concentration that if your dog was out that day and, drank some water, it would have had to drink a heck of a lot of water to get sick from these concentrations. They're really low. They're below EPA recommended kind of recreation values, but not by a ton. And so it's one of those things that we kind of as an organization want to keep an eye on and make sure that we're kind of identifying and being aware of where in our rivers and tributaries, where I'm sure you all, walk your dogs, or you're canoeing or paddling, where these places kind of can be, and that, there is a risk. So just kind of a little map of all of our non-detects were along the main stem of the Harpeth, but the ones that we actually got readings were kind of up in the tributaries where you may have had kind of a higher concentration of nutrients, maybe it was lower flow, maybe it had been sitting there for a while. And so that's and that there's not enough data here to draw really any conclusions, but that's kind of just a cursory glance at kind of what this kind of preliminary study was kind of looking at in some of our results. Here's kind of some pictures of kind of where we were sampling. Trace Creek was one of the ones where we found some toxin. This tributary near Bailey Road was another place where we found toxin. And then kind of to give you an idea of what the Harpeth might look like in kind of hot, pretty slow moving conditions. All of this, basically all the tinted stuff is algae, and you can kind of see, depending on the flow, it might be accruing on kind of the far bank a little more than on this near shore bank. I actually got in and waded over to that far bank to collect a sample where there was more algae, just to kind of make sure that we were doing our worst case scenario. And then I just wanted to touch base on a couple studies that are kind of relevant and have come out very recently. So this was a study basically looking at river systems, and a lot of algae research has been in lakes and oceans because that's where water can become very stagnant. But river systems, we generally think of them flowing and kind of cleaner in a way. But this study was actually looking at major river systems throughout the US. And basically our circles, kind of our little, what is that game, Trivial Pursuit circles, each one of those colors represents a different gene that will allow algae to produce the toxin. So basically if your color is lit up, so for the Ohio River, we've got green, red, and yellow. So that means algae have the ability to produce microcystin, saxitoxin, and cylindrospermopsin. If we've got a colored triangle, then that means the study actually found the toxin. And so I thought that was really interesting, because it basically is kind of across the US that these river systems, and as we know down here, the Cumberland flows right into the Ohio River. And so, there's mixing of, water and, in slow moving conditions, algae, kind of can move and actually can kind of, we can like not contaminate, but kind of can seed those different waterways. And so I just kind of wanted to, draw your attention to, we are kind of seeing these various toxin in these types of bacteria really showing up in many of the waterways across the country. Kind of another thing to touch on, and this is more of the public health thing, is this is a map of kind of where public health, I don't want to say outbreaks, but kind of where conditions or dangerous conditions have occurred in each state. And so we've got toxic outbreaks. So Tennessee kind of qualifies as a toxic cyanobacteria outbreak, but that just means that they're finding the toxin. But then we've got cyanotoxin poisonings, and so that's mainly going to be an animal. And then health advisories where people, I think Ken mentioned one at a beach on Lake Erie where they actually posted health advisories. I know it goes on all the time down in Florida and in California at the actual kind of ocean beaches. And then cyanotoxin poisonings and health advisories. And so that's actually, once you get a combination of a poisoning, that's usually going to be an animal, in addition to a health advisory, then that kind of might return a different protocol from the EPA, kind of a more urgent protocol. And so I just kind of wanted, this is kind of drawing your attention again to how widespread these are across the US, and it's not just coastal states, and it's not just states along the Great Lakes, but it's really everywhere. And you're even seeing Midwest and Western kind of inland states that are having some of these issues. And then finally, hopefully this is going to answer part of the question that was asked kind of at the beginning of this, is that we're now very recently, well, let me back up. So a large portion of the scientific community and literature about algae and toxin have been on planktonic cyanobacteria. And when I say planktonic, I mean basically any of the bacteria that are floating. So Ken mentioned mats and scums and what looks like spilled paint. All of that is planktonic and it's floating bacteria. But what we're starting to see, and people are starting to really kind of look at, are these benthic cyanobacteria that are attached to the rock and they look brown, and they, there might be a ton of it, or you might just see a little patch. And that we're finding that those types of algae can actually produce toxin as well. It's not very well known kind of how much, or whether or not, if you see a meter by meter area of brown algae, whether that's safe or not. I think that's kind of ultimately what the goal is for a lot of these, but right now it's kind of identifying these benthic algae that can produce toxin, and maybe trying to kind of like visually identify that where the riskiest ones are, or what types of toxin they produce, or when they produce it. But if you're talking about a slow-moving river that doesn't really have any surface algae, but you see a lot of the brown algae or the green algae that it's attached to rock, there's really no kind of way for any of the three of us to say whether or not that's safe, because if a lot of toxin is being produced from those benthic algae that's attached to rock, that I would hate to kind of speculate, and that could potentially be they could potentially be producing toxin as well. And without kind of knowing how much toxin they're capable of producing, that's kind of a tough call. And this is kind of my final slide, and the final slide for kind of all of our presentations. I'll leave this up here for a while. This is additional resources. You can go to our website. That's my contact information. If you want either other Dr. Jackwood's confirmation and have other veterinary questions you think about later, or questions for Ken about other algae things, feel free to send me a message, or and I can get you in contact with them. So thanks everyone for coming, and I think we'll kind of just go and start answering questions. And I'm not really watching the chat, so Haley, if you want to start kind of reading off things, or maybe manage the question section, that'd be awesome.
Sure. So, so I think you addressed kind of how common they are here. Then one was asked, what is the lifespan of the HABs?
Ken, you guys?
Well, so That's a good question.
Yeah, it is.
The lifespan of the HABs is really, they're kind of opportunistic. So as long as there's, light, warm temperature, and ample nutrients, they can keep growing. And what typically ends at least a bloom around here is, we get farther into the fall, the water temperature decreases, as well as, they start to run out of nutrients. And so that kind of dictates the lifespan of the HAB.
I think I did see a couple years ago where, Ken, maybe you remember this too. I think it was Florida that actually had a HAB off their coast year round.
Yeah.
It fluctuated in size, but it was warm enough that year and there was enough input of nutrients that it actually lasted the entire year. So that kind of gives you another perspective on kind of how long they last.
And this is Dory from the Harpeth Conservancy, especially if you think about rivers and small ponds. So the small pond where the livestock are can certainly, the stuff can actually grow much more readily. But a river could have, like in the dead of the summer where the Harpeth, when Ryan and I were sampling, you can have spots where it's the water slow, but then if you have a good rain event, it can flush it. So, I mean, these are the dynamics of the situation.
Yeah, true. It could be 2 days. The bloom could be 2 days here in a river after a big rain event. So,
and what we've learned from Dr. Burkholter when she came to visit in February, and she has a tremendous background in these types of algae, is what Ryan was showing you, is that there's people tend to think about the floating stuff. And so your pets, you have to watch out for what they're walking on and they're licking their fur. And the hard part for vets is they don't know what the animal's been exposed to. I mean, they come in with liver failure. So we need more people to sort of say, to kind of make the connection, at least pay attention to where you are and what you're doing so we can compile more data. Dr. Jackwood up in Ohio, it sounds like they're talking to you all and the vets, but I don't know if they're doing that in Tennessee yet. Ryan, other Dr. Jackwood, have you, with Judy Manners here in the state, are they connecting with the vets?
Not that I know of. They're starting to kind of collect data or kind of have sightings basically. But I don't know of any pamphlets or informational pamphlets going to vets that have really kind of highlighted. Mom, what did you guys get up there in Ohio? Were you getting posters or pamphlets or what was it? You're on mute. You're on mute, Mom. You're on mute.
I always take.
Mom, you're on mute.
Thank you. Sorry. So we got some posters, came to the vet clinic, and handouts for pet owners and for the veterinarians. Websites, they have a beach guard that had a website that you could try to monitor if you're concerned. I guess that somebody's monitoring some of the waterways, so you can check, are they finding toxins in the waterways that you're interested in, and basically reporting too. So they're using people to report what they're finding, in the water. So, like I said, it was from the Ohio Department of Health.
Okay. Yeah, right now I think down in Tennessee we're kind of just collecting anecdotal data. So like observations and whether or not they, see a bloom, and then reporting it to Tennessee Department of Health, which actually gets forwarded into a CDC kind of system that's trying to help monitor these things.
And that's a great segue. It was posted on here that there's some good information on the CDC under HABs and illness symptoms in freshwater. So another resource. We have a couple other questions that are very science related, and so I may even read them incorrectly. So Kathleen, I think I saw that you unmuted yourself, so I'm going to read your question. But do these toxins serve a function for the bacterium? Or are they some metabolite that is in abundance due to the huge amounts of bacteria?
Right. Yeah.
I used to know this, but I'm also a scientist, so I forgot. So refresh my memory, please.
So Ken,
you might tell the rest
of
of the people. I don't know. I don't understand the question. So
okay, so the idea, I'm going to set this up for you, Ken, and see what you think. So basically, the idea is that any kind of organism, if they're producing some kind of chemical or toxin, in this case a toxin, that it's serving them a purpose, or it's a kind of defense strategy.
Right.
And so one of the original hypotheses was that these algae produce the toxin to kind of eliminate other, maybe other species of algae, or to, eliminate, remove the competition so they can absorb more nutrients. Now, Ken, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think that's kind of been debunked, or that's at least like, it doesn't seem like that's totally true, because we can't really identify when the algae produce the toxin or the conditions that they produce the toxins, besides that maybe when nitrogen is higher, they're more likely to produce it. So evolutionary wise, we're not really sure why they developed the ability to produce the toxin, but we're kind of assuming it's connected to maybe excess nitrogen. Ken, is that kind of like how you read it?
So I mean, the jury's still out. It's still an open question as to why they produce the toxin. If it's a holdover from, these cyanobacteria have been around. I think if I'm remembering correctly, they produce the oxygen for our atmosphere, so they've been around.
Yeah, like billions of years.
And the thought that nitrogen drives it is just because the molecular structure of the toxin is very nitrogen rich. So you need a lot of nitrogen to make it. But yeah, I agree with you. It's unknown, and we actually have trouble predicting, which blooms are toxic and which blooms are not toxic. So toxin has a lot of questions revolving around it.
Hey, also, folks, just go ahead and unmute and just ask your questions too.
I was going to say,
feel free to jump in.
It begs a lot of very interesting questions, because if you could determine what's driving that, you might be able to create something that stops that process and to be used as a treatment to control these bacteria from producing the toxins. Does that make it?
No. For a long time, and Ken kind of mentioned this, for a long time we kind of thought that it was only phosphorus that was really driving the size of the bloom. Mm-hmm. And then depending on the size, you would get toxin production, and bigger means more toxin kind of thing.
Right.
But we found that nitrogen also plays a role in that, because it needs a lot of nitrogen to produce the toxin. So we really have to control both. If we have a small bloom and a ton of nitrogen, they may be able to produce more toxin than a much bigger bloom.
Right, exactly.
So you kind of have to. It's really a matter of kind of balancing the nutrients. The easy thing, I guess, I'll speak from a management perspective, is that phosphorus is easier to manage because it doesn't have an atmospheric component to its cycle. And so some of these algae can actually fix nitrogen from the atmosphere. So they may have kind of an unlimited supply of nitrogen. It's not really unlimited, because they have to use more energy to, fix the nitrogen and that kind of stuff. So, but phosphorus doesn't have an atmospheric component. So if you cut off the phosphorus and the bloom can't grow at all, then, you're kind of stopping it. But there are different kind of thoughts about how to manage these things. And
are either of you aware, are there any companies there are some companies out there that I've seen that are using molecular technology or molecular biology approaches to treatments for environmental problems. Are either of you aware of any companies that are developing products that might be useful in this regard?
You want that one, Ken?
Well, my answer is, I guess, pretty easy. I'm not too familiar with the treatment technologies for it. I've kind of heard of them here or there, but I don't think I know of any in depth.
I've seen a couple that basically use and I might get this wrong. I think it's a copper sulfide, maybe.
Mm-hmm. That's what golf courses use.
Yeah, and that actually
nice and toxic for frogs.
Yeah, I know. You don't want to put. I've heard of this.
Yeah, you're throwing a bunch more chemicals in to fix your problem. And
that's not what I'm talking about. What I'm talking about is understanding the bacterium and how they utilize the nitrogen and interfering with the molecular mechanisms at the molecular level to control these. I mean, that's That's what I.
Yeah, and that is being studied. I mean, we have kind of identified the genes that are required to produce the toxin. And so you're talking about almost kind of like genetic kind of, what am I trying to say? Genetic manufacturing or genetic, kind of.
It would just be something that
filtering.
the cell would take up that would block the ability for them to.
Yeah, block the
create the
pathway. Yeah, I don't think.
From a management standpoint, we need to reduce the amount of phosphorus and nitrogen in the waterways.
That's true. Yeah. Which
You
is
just don't
why
want to create the conditions. I think
Well,
Alexis wanted to jump in. Go, Alexis.
I just had a question for Ken. I live in Toledo and actually an alum of University of Toledo as well, so go Rockets.
Hey.
My question is, there's a recent forecast that came out for the HABs this summer, and I was wondering if you had any thoughts on that, and if you think that forecast is likely to change with the amount of rain we've been getting lately.
Yeah, so for those who don't know, the forecast is produced by NOAA each year, and it's really based off of how much phosphorus comes in from the Maumee River, which is the main a major tributary into the western basin of Lake Erie. I don't know if they'll change the forecast based on it. So the period where they measure the phosphorus is from the springtime, and it ends July 1st. So, and I think the recent rain you're talking about, maybe was like July 7th or something, just after the deadline. And so that, pull some nutrients can make it into the stream. And I just don't know if it's enough to actually change the size of the algal bloom at this point. But we did have some substantial rain. So it could be, it's without seeing the loading data, it's hard to know how much actually made it in during that point. But that's a great question.
Yeah.
So I know for some folks on here, and I saw from some of the chat, people are thinking, okay, how can I be more aware? Like when I take my dog out to go play, because everyone's going out and even when they go paddling and kayaking and stuff. So, and then also what all can folks do to either take pictures or report something, and who should they report to? So we can all be part of getting more information. Because I think a lot of this has just been people aren't aware, and the more they're aware, the more we'll learn. And there probably are some situations. We've had 1 or 2 board members over the years, which I never heard of this. And Dr. Jackwood, Ryan's mom, was that one of my board members' dogs got extremely ill and almost died. And they said it was like a liver toxin, and no one knew what it was, but she remembered it playing a lot during a really, really hot, dry time of year on the Harpeth. So I think people just aren't familiar. And we are working with some folks at Tennessee State University and USGS and some others running samples. So there's an agricultural sort of, in Tennessee, a sort of a working group on this, trying to bring with agriculture and others. So I think a lot of folks just figured it wasn't a huge issue, as you all said. So we'd like to see what all our members and people who are online tonight could actually do to help provide more information. Anybody, I think, Ryan, is there anything that we ought to be telling folks, like any best practices when they're out playing with their dogs?
I think that's a Judy question.
Okay, yeah.
Could you repeat it again?
Well, all right, if it's really hot and the water is really still, should they not go play in it? Wash them off afterwards? Those kind of guidance.
I guess I've learned that it's really kind of dangerous, and so you're probably better not playing. And it seems like this probably end of July, August, September time in our area, maybe longer in your area. Just you don't know. And now they're making me more nervous by the brownish, kind of algae that's on the bottom, because we see that. I kind of was hoping like a moving stream was going to be safer. I'm still kind of going with that a little bit, but I think the ponds and the lakes, you have to be careful.
Or like where things stagnate. I mean, I know some of the dogs died in Lake Lanier, right, in Atlanta, Ryan? Was that last year?
Yeah.
Stories, was that it?
And we had several in Austin that died from it as well on Lady Bird Lake.
So the bigger body might be diluted or running, but then you've got the stagnant areas where things can sort of build up. you know, we walk through it, but the dogs are running in it and playing around in it. So.
And I think we don't know about it. At least we're learning about it. That's huge.
That seems to be the answer to the question of how do we visually look and know? And I think that it's obviously you can see the green, right? Or you can see the brown, or you can see the coloration of the algae, but it can be present even without that, that if it's hot and still. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's, I mean, it sounds like it, you just don't, yeah, the hard thing is you just don't know. I guess you have to think about if conditions are right, that you have to just be careful.
And then somebody did ask what type of restoration can be done in areas affected by HABs, that if there are lasting side effects, you know, what can you do to restore the ecology after such a thing?
So kind of during the event, you're not going to really be able to do a whole lot unless it's direct intervention. And that's, like I was talking about, you're using a chemical to just, an algicide basically, to kill the algae. But oftentimes that's kind of ill-advised because these toxins are produced by the algae and actually stay within their cells for a period of time before they're released. So if you then lyse all the cells and burst them all open from this algicide, then you might just be releasing a whole bunch of toxin that's actually in these cells. I am very opinionated on this, so I will say my opinion. And some other people have different opinions, and that's okay. But I think it's controlling the input of nutrients basically from their runoff sources. So Ken mentioned it's either going to be agriculture or urban areas for the most part. And so controlling those inputs. At the Harpeth Conservancy here, we recently kind of controlled a point source from one of the sewage treatment plants. And that was getting them basically to kind of step up their treatment. So before they were releasing the water back into the river, we were kind of helped them kind of develop a way to release less phosphorus. I'm a very big advocate of environmental restoration and environmental engineering, and actually using large wetlands and even some kind of tricks that we can do by using different types of soil that absorb phosphorus, or different types of gravel that can absorb phosphorus, and then actually getting those phosphorus to be removed from the water and up into vegetation and plant life. And that kind of then removes your, kind of like short circuits your phosphorus flow from the land to the river to the lake. You're catching it in the river or before it even leaves the land. And so then you're kind of preventing it from going in that way. And that's kind of my take on how we need to handle agriculture. Other people would say that you need to kind of prevent so much fertilizer. That's where a lot of the agricultural phosphorus is going to be coming from, or kind of use better agricultural practices. But I'm not sold on that really.
Can I add to that? I work with Freshwater Future, and I've seen it firsthand, and I've done sort of the advocacy on both sides. In Toledo, it's a little different. And the numbers have changed, but I would say about 84% of our drivers for the HABs comes from agriculture and point sources. So for us, and most of our urban communities aren't likely, you know, going to be using fertilizers and things like that. It would be more wastewater or stormwater in that sense. But a large part of it is the CAFOs, the large farms, not the mom and pop smaller farms, but more so the large farms. And so what we've seen is that our governor, and there's studies that have shown if we cut that phosphorus input 40% from the agriculture side, we can start to see a drastic change in the health of our lake, Lake Erie Basin. So I think for what we've really been driven to do is encourage more, at least they've been encouraging more farmers to employ best practices. Got a lot of great farmers who take an initiative, but we understand it's not something that's done very easily and very cost efficiently. So they urge a lot of our legislators to, you know, employ incentives, but at the same time, you have a lot of bad actors who, you know, really aren't willing to do the, you know, the necessary best practices. So I would, I guess, it leads kind of into my question too, is have you in Tennessee seen any legislative change or ideas in terms of protecting bodies of water as it relates to nutrient pollution and things like that?
Dory or Jim, you want to take that?
Well, in Tennessee, and actually, I won't identify all the other people on the phone. There's some other people on this call who have a lot of experience in this as well. Under our state water quality standards, there is a nutrient narrative criteria. And so there's been more movement, and actually the Harpeth is being studied along with a lot of the cities on the Harpeth and the sewer plants and with the EPA to actually try and develop a total maximum daily load, fancy word for pollution reduction plan on the issue of nutrients. And we're trying to figure out what that might be in terms of preventing conditions that would lead to HABs. So that's kind of where we are here. But as far as legislation that might say, hey, agriculture, you have a certain point, you have a certain limit, no. We all struggle with that even at the national level. I know that politically there's more debate and discussion about that, like in Wisconsin and some other states. I think the more that we can break things up into like large agriculture, small ag, you know, runoff from a small urban lot versus a large stormwater system. You know, the sources vary instead of trying to oversimplify. So we have a lot of experience in stormwater. So some of the stormwater management just by default, also then by catching silt, helps reduce phosphorus. Mm-hmm. And Alexis, just for information, this area of the country, like everything's different. This area of the country in Middle Tennessee has limestone. So it has a lot of natural high phosphorus soils, which has also been interesting to try and get our minds around, well, so what does that mean? Does it mean we won't have them? Or does it, you know, like all these other things? It turns out we are seeing signs of toxins being made. So we got to figure out what those natural balances are and not just presume that we don't have to think about them. I think that's always a challenge when you're in management, when you're a regulator too, is and then you have certain people pressuring you to just not worry about it. I think in Tennessee, we have basically a blanket regulatory, Jim, what's it called? I mean, agriculture is basically exempt from clean water law.
That's right. Essentially, agricultural sources are not regulated under the Clean Water Act for nutrients.
Unless it's still, a CAFO kind of thing. And which
even with concentrated animal feeding operations, the regulation has been reduced over the past couple of years to where there's no longer for most CAFOs in Tennessee a requirement to get a permit to actually construct. And I would say that all rivers and streams are still subject to the requirement to meet water quality standards, even though they're narrative. The problem is the narrative is, it's very subjective. Agencies are very slow, and progress is not what it should be.
Yeah, the state Tennessee Environmental Conservation has some really good regulatory structure. They've been we're getting this erosion from some of specific lobbying interests like home builders and others. And that's really and I'm sure it all depends on where we are at the national level as well. So it's, I mean, we're all, anyway, now we're all talking shop, but I think what people don't really realize is that it's not that simple, and you can't just go say, hey, there's a rule for that. But there are a lot of basic better practices, and most people around here over fertilize. They think if they just throw more fertilizer on the grass. That was one of the chats. That's why we're going to have something specific coming up next month with our partners and buddies at in the ag department who study and do all the soils testing, because a lot of people don't realize that it's just money not needed, and we're just putting more phosphorus on the ground that just rolls right into the stream in the rain, because you just can't absorb any more phosphorus around here. But when you go to Lowe's, you don't really know what to buy.
Yep.
So I'm going to jump in. I think that we're 11 minutes past kind of when our time to end. I'll stick around for a couple minutes if people didn't get questions answered. I don't know if Ken or my mom have time, but this will be kind of our official end. And I'll say thanks to everyone who came. Feel free to email me, get on our website, or if you want to connect to Ken or other Dr. Jackwood, I'll be happy to put you in touch with them. And thanks everyone for coming. This was a lot of fun.
You will be receiving a survey from me in just a few minutes. We'd love your feedback about future topics or what else we can do to make this even better. So tune in and please let us know.
Thank you.
Hi, everybody.
Much.
Hi, Gwen. Hi, everybody.
Anyone have any other questions for Dr. J or Dr. J or?
Awesome. Thank you very much.
And there's no doubt, as Gwen Griffith, who's an old friend, worked at a number of our partner organizations, climate change is a big deal. You know, things are getting hotter, and that's why a lot of this stuff is happening across the globe. So
that makes sense. I just had one question, and obviously it's about my dogs. We had gone to Georgia, and it was the first time I ever saw blue-green algae, even though I read about it. And it was really like low, dense, like almost like sparkly, like this, like, but still swirly and whatever.
Mm-hmm.
And I called like shoreline people, and they were like, oh, well, if it's thin, then it's like basically okay, but it still scared me. So I was like, and what I'm getting from your guys' gist is it's not, like, don't mess with it. And there's one of them barking right now. Share. But I mean, I took them to Percy Priest today, and I was just staring at the water, and I was like, ooh, it's clear. I can see through it. It looks good. And then after we played a little bit, you know, it looked all shiny again. And I'm like, oh my gosh, is it there? So then I'm Googling. I'm like Googling, trying to figure out, and I didn't know if you guys are going to be working on, once you do all the testing, once you do have everything, is there going to be somewhere where we can go, or someone that we can call on Percy Priest or for like the Harpeth or whatever we're on, and be like, hey, what are the concentrations today, or what were the concentrations yesterday?
Great.
Or is it so sporadic that it can come and go? Because she was like, the shoreline lady in Georgia was like, oh, you know, it kind of clears up in the afternoon. And I was like, what do you mean it just clears up? Like, does it really just go away? Or are we just still learning so much about this? I just, you know, like my dogs and want them to live.
No, that's all extremely relevant. And that's a great segue back to Ryan and what we're working on with the monitoring network.
Okay.
And so I'll let him talk about it. But
yeah,
also, whenever you have those, take pictures. You can use our water reporter app and connect with Ryan, because we're trying to figure out places to sample.
Yeah,
Okay.
so that's ultimately our goal. There are places across the country that have these predictive models that actually basically have a pretty good guess on whether there's going to be algae at a certain location.
Okay.
We're still working on kind of the toxin aspect, but you can then, you know, get on your computer, look up that morning, and the model will be run for that day, and it'll say kind of like, hey, you know, there are good conditions out here today, so you should be pretty safe. That's going on in Ohio, and that's going on at other beaches, kind of coastal beaches and stuff too, that are really concerned about high recreation areas. And I think that's something that we really need here in Tennessee as well.
Yes.
So Mary, if you could take photos when you're out there just about different things, that will just help all of us get a better feel. And, you know, we've got a whole network with some of the state partners and everything else.
Okay.
So we can be doing sampling here and there to see, you know, it's like everything, we just need to, that's what we need. So many people are out there recreating. And so we need you all as eyes. And they're just very simple app called Water Reporter that you can take a picture, or maybe, which is one way, and then it's permanently captured, and you can just, and it's on our website, and it's something that was developed in Chesapeake that we brought to Tennessee.
Okay.
So it helps people like you when you're out there having a good time. Go, saw this, boom, took it.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it looked pretty good, but then, oh my gosh, when, Ryan, when you said brown, it was green, but it was on the ground, and I'm like, oh my gosh, what is that? Like, I don't know. It's just, I'm glad you guys
there's a lot of
had this.
algae out there that are not harmful. If
Yeah.
that doesn't necessarily mean that the system's not out of whack. So that's the trick. You don't want to be too alarmist, but we want people to be more aware, because it's definitely out there more than I think people realize.
Yeah.
Yeah, and you know, by and large, the less algae, the less potential for toxin. So, and that's kind of, you know, be your own judge kind of thing. If you would drink out of it, then, you know, then your dog would probably be fine. But most people kind of have a pretty good kind of inner kind of psychological response to whether or not the water looks clear, clean, or whether or not they'd want to be in it.
True. Oh, okay.
Does anyone else have any kind of closing questions that they wanted to speak in?
What was that app one more time that you had just mentioned?
Water Reporter. It's on. It should be on any of the app stores.
Okay.
And once you download it, if you'll download the Harpeth River, you'll join the Harpeth River group, and that'll link it all back through us.
Yeah.
Okay.
And you can be anywhere in the state, or the country. We don't care where you are when you use it, but that way we'll be able to see them all.
Yeah. Okay, great. Oh, there you go.
All right. Well, I guess
Good night, everybody.
we can wrap.
Thank you.
Thanks everyone for all your help.
Thank you.